The throne room of Veridia Prime was filled with tension as King Thalrex, sovereign of one of the galaxy's most powerful kingdoms, sat brooding. His fiery gaze rested on his daughter, Princess Alira, whose stance defied the royal decorum expected of her. She had always been a rebellious spirit, a force of will in a world of submission, and today was no exception. She stood before her father, arms crossed, her silver-blue hair glinting under the crystalline lights. She challenged his authority yet again, and this time the king had reached his limit. "You will not dishonor this kingdom any longer, Alira," Thalrex said, his voice cold, the weight of his anger palpable. "You parade around as if our traditions are mere suggestions, involving yourself with politics and mingling with the common folk." Alira's lips curved into a wry smile, barely containing her contempt. "Father, you rule a vast galaxy, and yet you fear one voice, a voice that speaks against the injustices you choose to ignore. I won't sit idly while you and the council twist the rules for your own gain." "Enough," Thalrex thundered, the walls reverberating with his fury. "You have refused every suitor, disregarded every duty, and now you claim to speak for the people as if you understand them. Very well, if you insist on mingling with those you claim to champion, then I will grant you that wish." Alira's defiance faltered for a moment as her father's expression grew dark. "What are you planning?" she asked, a slight tremor in her voice. Thalrex leaned forward, a cruel smile twisting his features. "Since you reject nobility and embrace the commoners so readily, you will marry one. I have chosen a suitor, a human, no less. His name is Tomas Reed, a foreman from the Tyrannus 5 mining colony. He is poor, humble, and everything you claim to value in others. You will be wed within the week." The assembled council members gasped, their whispers filling the room as they exchanged shocked glances. Marrying a human was unthinkable, especially for the Princess of Veridia. Alira's face flushed with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You can't be serious. I am your daughter, a princess of Veridia. This is beyond punishment. It's a humiliation." King Thalrex rose from his throne, towering over her. "This is a consequence, Alira. You will learn humility, or you will leave this palace in disgrace. Make your choice." Alira clenched her fists, her mind racing. She could defy her father, abandon her position, and walk away from the life she'd known. But she also understood the implications. If she left, she would lose any influence she had over the council and her people. The rebellion she'd dreamed of stirring would be lost. After a long silence, she straightened, her voice steady. "I will comply, father," she said, her words filled with bitterness. "But do not think this will break me." Thalrex gave her a curt nod, satisfied. "Then prepare yourself, daughter. Soon, you will be wed to your new life." As she left the throne room, Alira's heart was heavy with anger and sorrow. She had always known her father to be ruthless, but she hadn't anticipated the depths he would go to control her. She had no idea who this human foreman was, nor how he would react to being thrust into a marriage he had not chosen. But if her father thought this would tame her spirit, he was mistaken. She would find a way to turn this punishment into her advantage. Miles away, on the rugged mining colony of Tyrannus 5, Tomas Reed was blissfully unaware of the drastic turn his life was about to take. Tomas was an unassuming figure, known among his fellow miners for his strong work ethic, fairness, and unshakable sense of responsibility. He worked tirelessly in the mines, often taking on extra shifts to support his family back on Earth and the small community of workers who depended on him. That day, as he emerged from the depths of the mine, covered in dust and exhaustion, he was approached by a sleek, unfamiliar shuttle that had landed near the camp. A Veridian emissary stepped out, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Tomas. He walked over, his formal attire contrasting sharply with the dirt and grime of the mining colony. "Tomas Reed?" the emissary asked, his tone formal but detached. Tomas nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. "That's me. What's this about?" The emissary took a deep breath, as if preparing himself for a task he found distasteful. "By royal decree, you have been selected to marry Her Royal Highness, Princess Alira of Veridia. The wedding is scheduled for the end of the week. You are to accompany me back to Veridia Prime immediately." A hush fell over the miners, all eyes turning to Tomas, their shock mirroring his own. Tomas's mind raced, struggling to process the absurdity of what he was hearing. A princess? Marry me? He let out a nervous laugh, certain it had to be some kind of prank. I think you have the wrong person. I'm just a foreman here. The emissary's gaze remained steady. The order is legitimate. King Thalrex has decreed it himself. Your humble station is precisely why you have been chosen. You are expected to comply. Tomas's initial surprise shifted to a sense of unease. The idea of being forced into a marriage with a stranger, especially a royal alien princess, felt surreal. But he could see in the emissary's cold expression that refusal wasn't an option. The Veridians held enormous power, and he knew resistance would not be taken lightly. Turning to his fellow miners, Tomas tried to laugh it off, though his voice betrayed his apprehension. Well, lads, looks like I'm headed off to marry a princess. Don't expect me back anytime soon. One of his friends, Jarek, clapped him on the shoulder with a mixture of pride and concern. Take care of yourself, Tomas. Veridian royals aren't known for their kindness. Tomas managed a weak smile, but inside he felt as if he were stepping into a world he could barely understand, let alone belong to. With a heavy heart, he boarded the shuttle, looking out the window as the barren landscape of Tyrannus V disappeared beneath him. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet comprehend, and he felt a pang of homesickness for the simplicity he was leaving behind. As the shuttle hurtled through space toward Veridia Prime, Tomas found himself lost in thought. What kind of woman was this princess who would be forced to marry a poor miner? He wondered if she was as unwilling as he was, bound by the same chains of duty that now constrained him. The closer they came to Veridia, the more determined he felt to face this unexpected fate with the dignity he could muster. He might be a simple foreman, but he would not let anyone, not even a king, strip him of his self-respect. When they finally arrived at the majestic Veridian capital, Tomas was struck by the stark contrast between his world and theirs. Towering spires of crystal and glass pierced the sky, and opulent halls stretched before him, filled with people in garments that shimmered like starlight. As he was led to the palace, whispers followed him. A human in the palace of Veridia, and soon to be wed to the princess. The next day, Tomas was presented before the royal court, where King Thalrex sat in regal splendor. Alira stood beside him, her expression one of cool defiance. Their eyes met, and Tomas saw the same wariness he felt reflected back at him. Despite her alien beauty and proud stature, he sensed a trapped soul beneath the royal facade. She, too, was a prisoner of circumstance. In a voice dripping with mockery, Thalrex introduced them. Princess Alira, this is the man who will teach you humility. And Tomas, I trust you understand the honor you've been granted. Tomas straightened his posture, meeting the king's gaze with calm resolve. Your Majesty, I may not be a prince, but I don't need titles to know my worth. A flicker of surprise crossed Alira's face, and for a brief moment, Tomas thought he saw a glimmer of respect in her eyes. But she quickly masked it with a cool detachment, unwilling to show any emotion before her father. The ceremony was scheduled, the preparations made, and the Veridian court watched in stunned silence as the rebellious princess and the human foreman prepared to become husband and wife. The day of the wedding dawned, casting a golden glow across the gleaming spires of Veridia Prime. The entire planet seemed to hum with anticipation. Word of the union between the royal princess and a humble human had spread, igniting curiosity, confusion, and even outrage among the Veridians. Nobles in elaborate robes gathered from across the galaxy, their faces marked by mixtures of shock, amusement, and disapproval. They whispered among themselves, speculating on what had led King Thalrex to enforce such a scandalous match. In the grand ceremonial hall of the palace, preparations were underway. The decor was an awe-inspiring blend of Veridian and human traditions. Shimmering, floating crystals lined the aisles, casting rainbows of light across the ornate hall. Alien flora, rare and exotic, adorned the space, their bioluminescent petals gently pulsing in the dim lighting. Tomas stood alone in his dressing quarters, his heart pounding in his chest. He wore the traditional Veridian wedding robes, a complex layered garment of deep blue and silver, embroidered with strange symbols he couldn't decipher. The fabric was heavier than anything he'd ever worn, as if it bore the weight of the entire galaxy's expectations. He caught a glimpse of himself in the polished glass and almost laughed. He looked like an actor in a play rather than a man about to be married. The door opened, and a servant approached, bowing respectfully. "It's time, Foreman Reed." Tomas took a deep breath, nodding as he followed the servant through the intricate hallways of the palace. His mind raced with questions. Who was this woman he was about to marry? He had only seen glimpses of her, catching the regal tilt of her chin, the fire in her eyes as she faced her father. She was proud, that much he knew, and he wondered how she felt being forced into this union just as much as he was. As he reached the entrance to the ceremonial hall, he saw Princess Alira at the opposite end, preparing to enter. She was draped in a gown unlike any he'd ever seen, an ethereal garment that shimmered with every color in the spectrum, moving like liquid light across her form. Her silver-blue hair was adorned with intricate gemstones, and a veil framed her face, barely concealing the steely determination in her gaze. She looked like a queen, fierce and unyielding. Their eyes met, and for a moment they both hesitated, caught in the shared reality of what was about to happen. Then, as the ceremonial horn sounded, they stepped forward, walking down the aisle toward each other. The Veridian officiant, a tall, graceful figure with a serene expression, began the rites, speaking in a language Tomas could barely understand. He caught fragments of meaning, unity, tradition, harmony. As the words washed over him, he found himself glancing at Alira, who stood beside him with her chin held high, her face an unreadable mask. She seemed so distant, so composed, and he wondered if she felt as out of place as he did. When it came time to exchange vows, Tomas surprised himself. He looked into her eyes, speaking with a calm he hadn't anticipated. "I am here as a stranger in your world, but I promise to face this journey with honesty and respect. I will not force myself upon you, nor will I pretend to be someone I am not, but I will stand beside you as long as you stand beside me." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Alira's stoic expression softened for the briefest moment. She inclined her head, her voice steady as she replied, "I vow to uphold my duty, as it is my responsibility. I will not shy away from what has been imposed upon me, but I ask only one thing, that we do not mistake this alliance for love. We are bound by duty, nothing more." The words stung, but Tomas nodded, accepting her terms. He could hardly blame her. They were strangers thrown into an impossible situation, and he respected her honesty. The officiant continued the rites, binding their hands with a thin strand of Veridian silk, a symbol of unity and cooperation. As the final blessing was spoken, they were declared husband and wife. The crowd applauded, though the enthusiasm felt subdued, as if they were witnessing something surreal and slightly absurd. Tomas noticed the disapproving stares of the Veridian nobles and the smug satisfaction on King Thalrex's face. This was, after all, his way of showing his daughter that he could still control her, that she was not as independent as she believed. But as they walked down the aisle together, Tomas felt a shift, a quiet determination within him. This union might be forced, but he would not let it define him or trap him. He could sense a similar resolve in Alira's stride, her head held high despite the judgmental eyes upon them. They left the ceremonial hall, retreating to a quiet chamber prepared for them. The heavy silence between them lingered as they faced each other, alone at last. Tomas broke the silence, his tone respectful. "I know you didn't choose this, and neither did I. But I think we can make this work, if we respect each other's boundaries." Alira studied him, her gaze calculating. "You're remarkably calm for a man who's been thrown into marriage with a stranger from another world." Tomas offered a slight smile. "I've spent my life facing challenges, Princess. This is just a new kind." She gave him a faint nod, acknowledging his words. "Then let's be clear on one thing. This is a political arrangement, nothing more. My father may think he can break my spirit by tying me to a commoner, but I refuse to let him win. I need you to stay out of my way, and I'll stay out of yours." Tomas considered her request, feeling a pang of sympathy for her situation. He could sense her frustration, her desperation to escape her father's control. "Fine. We'll live as two strangers sharing the same space. I'll give you your freedom, as much as this arrangement allows." Alira's gaze softened, and for a brief moment he thought he saw gratitude flicker in her eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by her usual cool demeanor. "Thank you," she replied curtly, turning away. "Then let's see how long we can keep up this charade." With that, she left the room, leaving Tomas alone with the weight of their new reality. He sighed, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and relief. This was not the life he'd envisioned, nor was it the marriage he'd ever imagined. But he'd survived worse. He would navigate this arrangement with as much integrity as he could muster, even if his new wife regarded him with nothing more than polite detachment. Yet as he lay in the quiet of their shared quarters that night, Tomas found himself wondering if there was more to Princess Alira than the sharp-tongued, rebellious image she projected. She was intelligent, defiant, and fiercely independent, and despite her resolve to keep their lives separate, he couldn't shake the feeling that beneath her icy exterior there lay a heart yearning for freedom, perhaps even companionship. But for now, he accepted her terms, content to coexist in silence. The journey ahead was uncertain, but he had made his peace with it. After all, he was just a foreman thrust into a royal web of politics and power. Whatever came next, he would face it with resilience and the quiet strength that had carried him through the hardest days of his life. In the days following their wedding, life in the Veridian palace settled into an uneasy routine for both Tomas and Princess Alira. Despite their formal vows, they lived as near strangers, bound by duty but divided by worlds of difference. Alira kept herself busy with her personal pursuits, poring over documents, coordinating with her trusted advisors, and avoiding the courtly affairs her father had once forced upon her. She moved with the poise of a noble, carrying herself as if she were untouchable, unyielding. Tomas, meanwhile, found himself feeling like an odd fixture in the palace. The Veridian nobles gave him a wide berth, treating him with a polite but cold detachment. He was regarded as a curiosity, a human foreman thrust into the heart of royal life, and his presence was a source of fascination and gossip. Every time he entered the grand dining hall or crossed a palace corridor, he could feel the stares, the half-hidden smirks, and the muffled whispers trailing in his wake. But Tomas was no stranger to hard work and adaptation. Instead of feeling out of place, he focused on making himself useful. While Alira managed her affairs with a stubborn independence, he threw himself into learning about Veridian society, immersing himself in its language, culture, and customs. He spent hours in the palace library, poring over records, maps, and historical texts, hoping to understand the world he'd been thrust into. He wanted to be prepared for anything, and prove to himself and to everyone else that he could belong here, even if he was an outsider. Every evening, he would cross paths with Alira, sharing awkward, stilted conversations in their shared quarters. She kept to her side of the vast chamber, and he kept to his. Both of them caught in an unspoken agreement to respect each other's boundaries. Their interactions were minimal, brief exchanges of politeness or an occasional discussion about their plans for the day. Yet, despite the distance between them, Tomas found himself growing intrigued by Alira. She was more than just a rebellious princess. He could see flashes of vulnerability in her, moments when she let her guard down just enough for him to glimpse her inner turmoil. Her defiance was not rooted in petulance or vanity. It was a deep-seated desire for freedom, for a life outside the confines of royal duty. One evening, as Tomas returned to their quarters after a long day spent in the archives, he found Alira in front of the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. She stood silhouetted against the setting sun, her figure bathed in the golden light that poured through the glass. She looked almost ethereal, her usually sharp gaze softened by the quiet beauty of the evening. Not wanting to disturb her, he began to turn away, but she spoke, her voice breaking the silence. "Why do you keep doing it?" she asked, not turning to face him. Tomas paused, caught off guard. "Doing what?" "This," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the stacks of documents he carried. "Trying to fit in, trying to understand this world. You didn't choose to be here. You don't owe Veridia anything." Tomas considered her words, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe not, but I believe in making the best of where I am. And I'm here now, whether I like it or not." Alira finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "You could just wait it out," she said, a hint of bitterness in her tone. "Endure the time, do nothing, let my father think he's won." "That's not who I am," he replied simply. "I don't know if you'll ever believe me, but I'm not here to be a symbol of your father's punishment. I'm here because I want to understand what it means to be a part of your world, even if it's just in the smallest way. Alira's gaze softened, a faint look of surprise crossing her face. She seemed to study him, as though seeing him for the first time. You're not like anyone I've ever met, she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. The conversation left a quiet impression on both of them, a shift so subtle they barely noticed it at first. They continued with their lives, adhering to the same boundaries, the same routines, but now there was an unspoken respect between them. Alira no longer regarded him as an intruder, and Tomas found himself looking forward to their brief interactions. In the weeks that followed, Alira became accustomed to his presence, and little by little, their interactions grew less awkward. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her expression, the way she would pause before speaking when something was weighing on her mind. In turn, she began to take notice of the quiet resilience he carried, the strength that lay behind his humility. Despite their different backgrounds, they began to find a strange kind of companionship in their shared isolation. One evening, as they dined together in silence, Alira surprised him by breaking the usual quiet. "Tell me about your life on Tyrannus 5, she said, her voice tentative, as if she wasn't sure he'd be willing to share. Tomas looked up, a little taken aback by her interest. "It's nothing like this," he began, glancing around at the grandeur of the palace. "It's rough, raw. The mining colonies aren't built for luxury. We wake up at dawn, work until the sun sets, and sometimes even through the night. But there's a camaraderie there, a sense of belonging." He paused, smiling slightly. "It's the kind of place where you know everyone's name, where people come together to fix things, to share what little we have. It's not much, but it's honest work, and there's pride in that." Alira listened intently, a faraway look in her eyes. "That sounds liberating, to have a life of your own choosing, surrounded by people who respect you." "It has its moments," Tomas agreed, chuckling, "but it's not without its hardships. There's danger in the mines and life isn't guaranteed. But somehow, that makes every day worth more." For the first time, he saw a hint of envy in her expression, and it struck him that the princess, with all her wealth and privilege, might feel just as trapped as he did. He could see the longing in her eyes, a yearning for freedom that her title would never allow her. As the days turned into weeks, their conversations grew deeper. They talked about their dreams, their fears, and the lives they'd left behind. Alira told him stories of her childhood, of the weight of expectations that had been placed upon her from an early age, of the loneliness she felt in a palace filled with people who saw her only as a symbol. Tomas, in turn, spoke of the hardships his family faced, of his duty to send money back home, and of the sacrifices he'd made to provide for them. Gradually, they began to share more of themselves, each revelation bringing them closer. Though they were still bound by the arrangement they had set, an undeniable connection formed, something that neither had anticipated. They were no longer just strangers forced into a marriage. They were two individuals caught in a web of fate, navigating a life they hadn't chosen together. One night, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the palace grounds, Alira turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think it's possible to find freedom even when you're bound by duty?" she asked softly. Tomas looked out at the stars, his gaze distant. "I think freedom isn't always about breaking away. Sometimes it's about finding purpose within the constraints you're given, making choices, even small ones, that let you live with integrity." She considered his words, nodding slowly. "Perhaps you're right," she murmured, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "Maybe there's more to this, to us, than either of us realized." They shared a quiet smile, a silent understanding passing between them. They were bound by duty, but in that moment they felt a strange sense of liberation. In their unchosen bond, they had found an ally, a confidant, and maybe, just maybe, the beginnings of something more. As the night wore on, they stood together, side by side, gazing at the vast expanse of stars. In that shared silence, they both felt the first flickers of hope, a small spark in the darkness that neither dared name. As the months passed, Tomas and Alira's relationship deepened, though neither would openly admit it. They'd both begun to sense an unspoken alliance between them, a quiet partnership that transcended their forced marriage. The awkwardness that had once hung over their conversations was replaced by a growing sense of mutual understanding. They shared meals together, worked side by side on small projects within the palace, and even began to look forward to their evenings on the balcony, where they would speak of life, dreams, and the desires that bound them both. One afternoon, while visiting the palace archives to pursue a history of Veridian rule, Tomas stumbled upon something unusual. As he sifted through ancient documents, he found records of the mining colonies under Veridian control. Flipping through the pages, he saw stark disparities. The colonists were being severely underpaid, while tax documents indicated excessive profits flowing back to the capital. Furthermore, the reports claimed the colonies received resources for equipment repairs, medical supplies, and worker support. But Tomas knew from experience that the colonies rarely saw any of this. Alira found him that evening, seated at the grand table in their quarters, surrounded by the records he had gathered. She raised an eyebrow, folding her arms with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "What is all this?" Tomas looked up, the intensity in his gaze unmistakable. "It's a mess, that's what it is," he replied, tapping a finger on one of the reports. "Veridia's mining colonies are barely getting by, but according to these records, they're supposed to be well-funded and supported." Alira moved closer, her interest piqued. She took one of the documents, scanning the figures with a frown. "These funds, they're substantial, but I know for a fact that my father's treasury doesn't show expenses this high." She glanced at Tomas, her expression darkening. "It means someone is diverting the money, either within the treasury or—" She trailed off, her eyes hardening as the implications sank in. "Or it's your father." Tomas finished, his voice low. He looked at her, uncertain. "Are you sure you want to investigate this? If King Thalrex is involved, this could be dangerous. For both of us." Alira's jaw tightened, and Tomas could see the fierce resolve in her eyes. "If someone is exploiting the colonies and lying to my people, I can't turn a blind eye. Besides," she added with a faint smirk, "I've never been one to back down from a challenge." Their investigation began in secrecy. Night after night, they sifted through records, piecing together evidence that revealed a pattern of misappropriated funds, fake contracts, and forged signatures. They discovered that resources meant for the colonies were being funneled to private accounts tied to high-ranking officials. The network was extensive, implicating many nobles who had been close allies of her father. One evening, while they were hunched over the documents, Alira glanced up, her expression unusually soft. "You know," she began, her voice thoughtful, "I never thought I would end up doing this, working with you like this. But I've come to value your perspective. You see things differently from the nobles, from my family. It's refreshing." Tomas smiled, feeling a warmth at her words. "I appreciate that. And honestly, I never thought I'd be in this palace, let alone married to a princess." He paused, then added, "But I think I understand why you fight so hard. You're not just rebellious, you care deeply. You want things to change." Alira's gaze softened, and for a moment the cold wall she kept between them seemed to melt. She placed her hand on his, just a brief touch, but one that conveyed more than words could express. "I do," she said quietly, "and maybe together we can do something meaningful." As they continued their investigation, they started making discreet alliances within the palace. Alira reached out to trusted advisors and a few sympathetic nobles, while Tomas enlisted the help of workers within the palace staff who had family in the mining colonies. Together, they quietly built a network of supporters who were appalled by the corruption they uncovered and who shared their desire for change. Their efforts continued to bear fruit, but with success came danger. Alira and Tomas knew they were walking a fine line. They were investigating powerful figures, people who would do anything to protect their wealth and status. Alira had already received veiled threats from members of her father's council, thinly disguised warnings that she should focus on more royal pursuits. But she brushed them off, determined to see their plan through. One evening, while they were poring over new documents in the archives, they heard footsteps echoing down the corridor. Alira quickly snuffed out the lights, motioning for Tomas to be silent. They huddled behind a shelf, holding their breath as two shadowed figures entered the room, their voices low but urgent. "The princess and her human consort," one of them whispered. They've been asking too many questions, and the king's patience is wearing thin. We can't let them jeopardize the operation, the other replied. If they dig any deeper, they'll find everything. We may need to handle them. Alira felt a chill run through her. She glanced at Tomas, her eyes wide with realization. They were no longer just nuisances, they had become threats. As the figures exited, Tomas exhaled slowly, his voice a tense whisper. We need to be careful, Alira. If your father or his allies discover what we're doing, they won't hesitate to eliminate us. Alira nodded, her gaze steely. I know, but we're too close to the truth to back down now. In the following days they doubled their efforts, all the while watching their backs and speaking in hushed tones. Every interaction, every meeting was conducted with caution, but the pressure weighed heavily on them, and Tomas could see it taking a toll on Alira. She looked exhausted, the fire in her eyes dimming under the constant strain. Despite her resilience, he could tell that her trust in her own family, in the world she'd once believed in, was fracturing. One evening, as they returned to their quarters after another long day of subterfuge, Tomas found her standing by the window, gazing out at the city lights with a look of quiet despair. She didn't hear him approach until he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. She turned, her eyes filled with a vulnerability she rarely showed. All my life, I believed I could make a difference, she murmured, her voice barely audible. I thought my father cared, that he ruled for the good of his people. But now I'm not sure what's real anymore. Tomas's heart ached at her words. He took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Alira, you're not alone in this. I may not be Veridian, and I may not know all the ins and outs of palace life, but I'm here. With you. We're doing this together. Her gaze softened, and she held onto his hand a moment longer than necessary. Thank you, Tomas, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know if I would have had the strength to face this alone. In that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't spoken, but a silent understanding passed between them. A promise. A bond that transcended their forced marriage. They weren't just two individuals bound by circumstance. They were partners, allies in a battle that went beyond duty and tradition. As they prepared for the next phase of their investigation, Tomas knew that he would stand by Alira, no matter the cost. He respected her strength, admired her courage, and though he hadn't admitted it to himself until now, he cared deeply for her. She was no longer just the rebellious princess or the woman forced into his life. She was his equal, someone he would protect and fight for, come what may. And Alira, though still guarded, felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in months. She had found someone who not only supported her, but who understood her, truly understood her. For all their differences, Tomas was the only person who saw her for who she was. Not as a princess, not as a symbol, but as Alira. Word of Alira and Tomas's investigation began to spread, despite their efforts to keep it secret. A few trusted allies in the palace provided them with valuable information, but they also brought warnings. The corruption they were uncovering ran deeper than they had imagined, reaching not only into the noble houses, but potentially into the heart of the Veridian throne itself. Tensions grew, and Alira found herself increasingly isolated. She could no longer trust her father's advisors, nor most of the nobles she had once associated with. One night, as they were quietly discussing their findings, they received an unexpected visitor. A young woman named Malia, one of King Thalrex's closest aides, entered their quarters, her eyes wary but determined. Alira and Tomas exchanged a cautious glance before Alira nodded, inviting her to speak. Malia took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. I know what you're doing, she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. I've seen you sifting through records and speaking with the servants. You're right, there's something sinister happening in Veridia, and it's been happening for years. But it's not just about the money from the colonies. It's about control. Power. Alira's expression hardened. Do you mean my father is behind all of this? Or are there others pulling the strings? Malia hesitated, her gaze darting to Tomas. It's difficult to say, she admitted. Your father is not the man he once was. He was once a fair and just ruler, but his ambition has overtaken him. Some of his advisors, men who've profited from his decisions, are complicit in this corruption. They've convinced him that these colonies are a means to an end, that they serve only to fuel the expansion of his empire. Tomas frowned, exchanging a grim look with Alira. And what does that mean for the people of Veridia? For the colonies? Malia's expression softened with sorrow. It means that your lives and your struggles are nothing more than numbers on a ledger to them. They view the colonies as resources to be exploited, and any cries for change are ignored or silenced. Alira's heart clenched at the realization. Her father had once been the man she admired most in the galaxy, a king who promised to rule with compassion and fairness. But now, he was nothing more than a figurehead for greed and cruelty. Malia continued, her voice soft but resolute. I don't know if I can change things alone, but I want to help you. I've seen the good you're trying to do, Princess, and I believe in it. My loyalty to the throne is second to my loyalty to Veridia itself. Tomas looked at Alira, nodding subtly. It seems we're not the only ones who want change. Alira considered Malia's offer carefully. This could be the opportunity they needed to expose the corruption and hold the king's allies accountable. She extended her hand to Malia. Then we work together. We need all the allies we can get. Malia took her hand, her expression determined. Together we can bring down those who have betrayed Veridia. But we must act quickly. If they catch even a hint of our alliance, they will destroy us. The three of them began coordinating in secret, using Malia's access to the king's private documents to gather evidence. Malia provided them with access to restricted areas within the palace, places where incriminating records were hidden away. With her help, they uncovered contracts, bank records, and correspondence that revealed a vast web of bribes, deceit, and exploitation. Every night, they met in hidden corners of the palace, poring over documents, analyzing every piece of information that could expose the truth. The bond between Tomas and Alira grew stronger as they worked side by side, their shared mission bringing them closer than ever. They were no longer just partners in a marriage of convenience. They were allies, friends, and something more that neither dared to name. Their progress was swift, but their investigation did not go unnoticed. Despite their best efforts to keep their actions secret, whispers began circulating in the palace that Princess Alira and her human consort were meddling in affairs they had no business knowing about. Tension grew, and the people they had thought were allies began to distance themselves, fearful of being implicated. One evening, as Alira, Tomas, and Malia gathered to finalize their findings, they were interrupted by a knock at the door. Malia opened it, revealing a familiar figure, General Kalis, one of King Thalrex's most trusted advisors. He stepped into the room, his eyes narrowed, his expression cold and calculating. I see the rumors were true, he said, his voice a dangerous whisper. The princess has chosen to ally herself with traitors and spies, and here I thought you had better judgment, Alira. Alira's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. I am loyal to Veridia, General Kalis. I have uncovered evidence that proves our people are being exploited by those who would bleed them dry for profit. Keyless laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Your loyalty is misguided, Princess. This evidence you think you found is nothing more than business. The colonies are assets, and assets must yield profit. This is how the galaxy works, and your father understands that. Why don't you? Tomas stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. Your so-called business is destroying lives. People in the colonies are suffering so you and your kind can live in luxury. If you think we'll stay silent, you're mistaken. Kalis's gaze shifted to Tomas, his expression one of contempt. Ah, the human foreman speaks. You are nothing more than a tool in a game you do not understand, Foreman Reed. Do you really believe a commoner like you can change anything? Before Tomas could respond, Alira spoke, her voice laced with defiance. General Kalis, you are the one who misunderstands. I may be my father's daughter, but I will not stand by while he allows this kingdom to be destroyed from within. Kalis's expression darkened. Then you leave me no choice, Princess. He reached into his robes, drawing a concealed weapon. But before he could raise it, Malia moved swiftly, striking his arm and forcing him to drop the weapon with a sharp cry of pain. A struggle broke out as Kalis lunged for Tomas, who sidestepped and managed to wrestle the general to the ground. Alira grabbed the weapon, her hands trembling as she aimed it at Kalis, her face pale but determined. Enough, she shouted, her voice echoing in the chamber. "This ends now. Kalis, you will tell my father everything. The truth about the funds, the exploitation, and the corruption that has poisoned our kingdom." Kalis sneered, still pinned under Tomas's grip. "You think your father will listen to you? He cares more about his power than he does about you or your precious ideals." Alira's expression hardened. "Then we'll see how he reacts when the entire court hears of your betrayal. We have enough evidence to expose you and every single one of your co-conspirators." For the first time, fear flickered in Kalis's eyes. He realized that the princess he had once dismissed as a rebellious nuisance had grown into a formidable opponent, one who would not rest until justice was served. With Malia's help, they restrained Kalis, binding his hands and securing him in a hidden chamber within the palace. Alira and Tomas took a moment to catch their breath, the weight of what they had done settling upon them. Tomas looked at Alira, admiration shining in his eyes. "You were incredible, Alira. I've never seen anyone stand up to someone like him." Alira managed a faint smile, her heart still racing. "I didn't think I had it in me. But I knew I couldn't let him get away with it. Not after everything we've uncovered." They both knew that the battle was far from over. They would need to confront King Thalrex, to force him to face the truth about his advisors, his wealth, and his complicity in the suffering of his people. It was a dangerous course, one that could cost them everything. But in that moment, as they stood together, bruised but unbroken, they realized that they were ready to face whatever came next. They were no longer just bound by circumstance or duty. They were bound by shared purpose, loyalty, and something deeper that had grown quietly between them over the long nights of their investigation. For the first time, Alira felt a glimmer of hope for Veridia and a sense of gratitude for the partnership she had found with Tomas. The dawn of the confrontation had arrived. With Kalis bound and their evidence meticulously gathered, Alira, Tomas, and Malia prepared themselves for what could be the most dangerous day of their lives. The trio made their way through the vast corridors of the palace, each of them carrying a copy of the incriminating documents that detailed the corruption within Veridia. Alira walked ahead, her posture tall and regal, her eyes steely with determination. Tomas followed close behind, his own expression hardened, his presence a steady anchor beside her. Malia brought up the rear, her gaze darting cautiously around every corner, fully aware that danger lurked behind every pillar. As they neared the throne room, Alira took a deep breath, glancing back at Tomas. He offered her a brief nod, his eyes filled with quiet encouragement. She felt a surge of strength, knowing that he was there with her, a partner in both purpose and spirit. Finally, the great doors of the throne room loomed before them. Flanked by royal guards, the massive doors stood as a symbol of her father's absolute authority. Alira steadied herself, signaling to the guards to open them. She walked into the throne room with Tomas and Malia by her side, their footsteps echoing across the gleaming floor as they approached King Thalrex. The king was seated on his throne, surrounded by his advisors and nobles, many of whom were implicated in the corruption they had uncovered. Thalrex's expression was one of mild amusement as he regarded his daughter and her entourage as if they were nothing more than an entertaining diversion. But Alira's unflinching gaze cut through his air of indifference. "Father," Alira began, her voice resonant, unyielding, "we need to speak. This is not a plea or a request, it is a demand." Thalrex's amusement faded, his brow furrowing at her defiance. "A demand?" he repeated, a hint of warning in his tone. "You overstep, Alira. You are my daughter, not my equal. Speak with the respect your title requires." "Respect must be earned, father," Alira replied, unbowed. She lifted the stack of documents in her hand, displaying them for all to see. These documents reveal the truth about the exploitation of Veridia's colonies, the diversion of funds, and the suffering inflicted on our people for the profit of a few. Murmurs rippled through the assembly, the nobles shifting uneasily, glancing at each other with growing alarm. Thalrex's gaze darkened, his tone cold and dismissive. "I do not know what game you are playing, Alira, but this is no place for childish rebellion. Put those papers down and return to your chambers." Tomas stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "With all due respect, Your Majesty, this is not rebellion. It is justice. These documents contain proof of your advisor's betrayal. They have siphoned wealth and resources meant for the colonies, enriching themselves while leaving countless lives in ruin. One of the advisors, a portly noble named Lord Callan, rose from his seat, his face red with indignation. This is an outrage. These accusations are baseless. I will not stand here and be slandered by a human. Alira fixed her gaze on Lord Callan, her voice cutting. We have all the evidence we need, Lord Callan. Your personal accounts, your secret meetings, and the directives you gave to strip the colonies bare. The people of Veridia will know what you've done. Thalrex's face hardened, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his throne. Enough, he thundered, rising from his seat. You would turn against your own father, your own king, Alira. You would tear down everything we have built. Alira's voice was steady as she replied. What we have built, father, is a kingdom of suffering for those who cannot defend themselves. This corruption has tainted everything Veridia was meant to stand for. And if you refuse to change, then you leave me no choice but to oppose you. The assembly fell into a stunned silence, the weight of her words settling over them. For a long moment, father and daughter stared at each other, locked in an unspoken battle of wills. Thalrex's gaze shifted to Tomas, his expression twisted with disdain. This is your doing, isn't it, human? You have poisoned her mind with your low-born ideals, made her forget her duty. Tomas met the king's glare without flinching. Your daughter has a mind of her own, your majesty. She sees the suffering of the people because she chooses to, not because I or anyone else told her to. The king's expression turned cold. He hit his voice a deadly whisper. Then you leave me no choice. Guards, arrest them. Take them to the dungeons. They will learn what it means to challenge the throne. The guards stepped forward, hesitation evident in their faces. Alira's voice rang out, clear and commanding. I am the princess of Veridia, and I command you to stand down. I have served my duty, as has every loyal Veridian here. But I will not be silenced, nor will I allow this kingdom to fall into ruin. Her words struck a chord, and several of the guards hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Malia took a step forward, her voice filled with conviction. The princess speaks the truth. This corruption has gone on long enough. Will you stand by and let Veridia's people suffer? Or will you stand with us? More guards shifted their stances, uncertain, but a few nodded in support, emboldened by the bravery of Alira and her allies. The sight of his own soldiers turning against him struck Thalrex deeply, and he clenched his fists, his gaze livid. You would betray your own blood, Alira? He asked, his voice trembling with fury. No, father, Alira replied quietly. I am trying to save our people. If you cannot see that, then I pity you. A tense silence fell over the throne room, but the guards made no move to arrest Alira, Tomas, or Malia. In that moment, it was clear that the balance of power had shifted. Alira stood tall, her gaze steady as she looked at her father, her voice resolute. From this day forward, I will fight to bring justice to Veridia, to restore honor to our name. And I will do it without fear, without hesitation. King Thalrex, realizing he had lost, sank back into his throne, his face ashen. His allies had been exposed, his power weakened, and his daughter had proven herself stronger than he had ever anticipated. In the days that followed the confrontation, news of the corruption scandal spread like wildfire. Alira, with the support of Malia, Tomas, and the newly loyal members of the Palace Guard, began the work of dismantling the web of corruption that had plagued Veridia for years. The implicated nobles were tried, stripped of their titles and exiled, their ill-gotten wealth redistributed to support the colonies they had exploited. King Thalrex, humiliated and broken, retreated into solitude, leaving Alira to take on many of the responsibilities of ruling. Though he remained technically on the throne, his influence was diminished, his voice a mere whisper in the corridors of power. Alira and Tomas worked tirelessly, traveling to the colonies to address their grievances, allocating resources, and overseeing the restructuring of Veridia's government. With every speech, every decree, Alira earned the respect and admiration of her people. Tomas, who had once been nothing more than a humble foreman, was now regarded as a hero and a symbol of justice. Standing by Alira's side as her trusted advisor and, increasingly, her confidant. One evening, as they returned from a particularly grueling day visiting the colonies, Alira and Tomas found themselves alone on the balcony of the palace, gazing out at the stars. They had come so far, yet there was still so much to do. Alira looked at Tomas, a soft smile playing at her lips. I never imagined that I would find a friend in this marriage, much less someone who would change my life in so many ways. Tomas returned her smile, his expression warm. Neither did I. I never thought I'd find myself in a palace, let alone fighting corruption with a princess. They shared a laugh, the weight of their journey lifting, if only for a moment. Silence settled between them. But it was no longer the awkward silence of strangers. It was the comfortable, knowing quiet of two people who had been through fire together, who had emerged on the other side as more than just partners. After a moment, Alira reached out, taking Tomas's hand in hers. You've given me more than just support, Tomas. You've reminded me what it means to have faith in something greater than myself, and for that, I will always be grateful. Tomas's heart swelled at her words. He lifted her hand, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The feeling is mutual, Alira. You showed me that there's more to life than duty, that even in the darkest places, there's room for hope and even love. She held his gaze, a question unspoken in her eyes. Slowly they leaned toward each other, and in that moment, the walls they had so carefully constructed fell away. They shared a kiss, soft and tender, a promise of a future unbound by the expectations of others. Together, they had changed Veridia, standing up against forces far greater than themselves. But now, as they held each other under the starlit sky, they knew they had forged something even stronger. A bond built on trust, respect, and the hard-earned love that had grown from the unlikeliest of beginnings. In the months and years that followed, Veridia prospered under Alira's leadership, with Tomas by her side. Together, they redefined what it meant to rule, showing the galaxy that even the most unlikely of alliances could bring about profound change. And in the end, their story became a legend, a tale of courage, justice, and the love that had united a rebellious princess and a humble foreman, forever transforming the fate of a kingdom.